Hello and welcome to Novara Live. I'm Moya Lothian-McLean. I've been away for a while. You may not recognise me, but I am in fact she. And tonight I'm joined by a new face, Micha Frazer-Carroll. Hello.
Hi Moya, how are you doing?
I'm okay. I'm wondering if the audience will be able to take our joint sleigh, but I'm sure we'll soon find out. Coming up later tonight, UK teens are the most unhappy in Europe. You and me both, bro. The UK's new rail minister has been exposed for getting a worker fired. And finally, some good news for UK climate campaigners. But first, another smoking ban could be on the way. Potentially cheering news for partners of smokers bracing themselves for a winter spent shivering in a pub garden, because the government is supposedly considering proposals to ban smoking outdoors in certain areas. According to a Sun exclusive, leaked Whitehall documents reveal smoking could be banned in the likes of pub gardens, children's playgrounds, and outdoor sports stadiums. These suggestions would form part of the Tobacco and Vapes Bill, which was, if you may remember, a key policy of the previous Conservative government. That legislation promised to progressively raise the age at which people could legally buy cigarettes until there would be a generation who were legally unable to purchase them. That bill was shelved due to the election, but in July's King's Speech, Labour promised to resurrect it. These new leaked proposals go further than any Conservative plans, though. And when questioned today, Prime Minister Keir Starmer did not deny that an outdoor smoking ban might be on the table.
It's being reported that you're looking at tighter restrictions on smoking outdoors, pub gardens, outdoor restaurants, outside hospitals and so on. Is that something that you are considering?
My starting point on this is to remind everyone that over 80,000 people lose their lives every year because of smoking. That's a preventable death. It's a huge burden on the NHS. And of course, it's a burden on the taxpayer. So yes, we are going to take decisions in this space. More details will be revealed, but this is a preventable series of deaths, and we've got to take the action to reduce the burden on the NHS and reduce the burden on the taxpayer.
You said when you became Prime Minister you wanted politics to tread more lightly on people's lives. This is the opposite, isn't it?
Look, I think it's important to get the balance right. But everybody watching this who uses the NHS will know that it's on its knees. We have to relieve the burden, and that's why I spoke before the election about moving to a preventative model when it comes to health. I want the NHS back on its feet, but I also want it fit for the next, 75 years, just as we've had a brilliant 75 years already. And that means taking action in relation to preventable deaths, and these are 80,000 a year preventable deaths.
Obviously, a backlash has swiftly kicked off. Two contenders for the Conservative leadership have also waded in. Robert Jenrick asked on social media why Starmer was, quote, focusing on this nonsense. Priti Patel called the proposals, quote, nanny state regulations. I mean, they were introduced by the last Conservative government, but who's counting? Nanny state or not, tobacco use does remain the single biggest cause of preventable illness and premature death in England, making it undeniably a huge pressure on the NHS. What's interesting about these leaks is Starmer could have called them for what they are, which is proposals to be considered, likely put together by civil servants for the last government to look at. But he didn't, which means they might well happen. Is this the best way of tackling health issues caused by tobacco use, though? Well, if the government do take these proposals forward to legislation, they may be encouraged by this snap polling on the issue from YouGov. 58% of the public say they would support the plan, split between 35% saying they strongly support and 23% tending to support. In contrast, 17% say they oppose and they're all my mates, and 18% strongly oppose. Micha, do you think an outdoor smoking ban is too mollycoddling? And can you actually see it happening?
Yeah, I actually do think it's too mollycoddling. I feel like you can't really make the same arguments that were made for example, the indoor smoking ban, which was, that people passively smoke, they inhale the toxins, and so it's not really fair on people who are in the environment. When people go outside to the smoking area in a pub, in a club, I think there's kind of an understanding that most of the people there are smokers, that it's their decision. It's obviously ventilated because it's outside, and like people should be able to make decisions about their own health. But I actually think this is not the thing that annoys me most about this suggested policy. I think what I don't like about it is the fact that it really reflects what Starmer's approach is to the NHS, which is, within very restrictive fiscal rules. He basically doesn't want to reverse years of NHS cuts. So he's implementing a policy that costs him nothing, with the aim of reducing the sickness burden on the NHS. And I think what Starmer could really do in this situation, which I don't think he is going to do, is to reverse over a decade of NHS austerity, which would improve waiting times, it would improve staff shortages, numerous systemic problems, and give us a health service that actually functions. I also think another thing that's annoying about this policy is that it doesn't get to the root cause of smoking. So, for example, there are educational initiatives that could happen, educating people on making their own decisions around their health, which could also reduce the number of people who smoke. So yeah, this really feels like the kind of lazy route to alleviating pressures on the NHS. It's also bound to hurt pubs and clubs. And I think if it does go through, like you've mentioned, it's going to annoy a lot of people. So I don't think it's a good decision from Starmer.
That's a really great point, that he's kind of attacking literally the symptoms rather than the causes. Do you think it's telling that, because I remember this policy was announced, right? I remember us all being like, this is just another distraction policy, tinkering around the edges from Rishi Sunak, throwing whatever he could at the wall, hoping it would stick. And when it got dropped before the election, we're like, of course it's getting dropped. Is it telling that this has been picked up with immediacy by Keir Starmer's Labour government? And when given the opportunity to deny that this is going to be a priority, he's done the opposite.
Yeah, I think that it is interesting that it's been picked up. My interpretation of some of the impetus behind Rishi Sunak suggesting, the vapes ban, etc., was to kind of have something that something to be remembered by, that was kind of a big flagship policy. And I thought that was kind of a thing that he was going for on the way out. So I do think it's interesting that Starmer has kind of picked up this smoking issue again. And I think it's probably another example of the huge amount of continuity between the last government and the current Labour government.
Licenses to explore 2 huge North Sea oil and gas projects were granted by the last Tory government, much to the anger of climate campaigners. But a new decision by the Labour government means that both projects may now not go ahead. The first is the massive Rosebank oil and gas field located west of Shetland and the UK's largest untapped oil field. The other is east of Aberdeen, the Jackdaw gas field that was projected to produce enough gas to power 1.4 million UK homes. The granting of the Rosebank licence was hugely contentious for climate campaigners. It was approved by Rishi Sunak in September last year, giving Norwegian energy company Equinor the right to drill for oil on the seabed and fund the FT podcast further. But campaigners argued that the field would release around 130 million tonnes of carbon dioxide over its lifetime. That is the equivalent to the annual emissions of 90 countries. And the licence came in the context of the International Energy Agency declaring that no new oil fields could be developed if the world was to meet its 2050 target climates. Pandering to the climate-sceptical right wing of his party and citing the need for Britain to have energy independence, Rishi Sunak declared the drilling could go ahead. But in the wake of Sunak's decision, climate groups Greenpeace and Uplift asked a judge to review the government's decision-making process. The Tory government had planned to defend the licences in that judicial review. But in June, the Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling, holding that potential emissions from the burning of unearthed fossil fuels must be considered before drilling licences are approved. Before that ruling, energy companies usually only considered the emissions involved in the extraction of the fuels. So it really was a game changer. And as a result, the Labour government has decided it really is not worth defending the Rosebank and Jackdaw licences in court. The government's decision to withdraw from the case doesn't mean the energy projects definitely won't go ahead. The judge will first have to decide whether Rosebank operator Equinor or the Shell subsidiary that operates Jackdaw did consider all the relevant emissions in their environmental impact assessments. Now, if the judge finds that they did not take the emissions from burning the fuel into account, Wonder how that will go. That will mean the licenses granted by the Tories are void, but the operators could still submit new assessments and reapply to the government for licenses. If that happens, though, they will likely run straight into this manifesto commitment from Labour. We will not issue new licenses to explore new fields because they will not take a penny off bills, cannot make us energy secure, and will only accelerate the worsening climate crisis. Now, I'm joined by Tessa Khan, Executive Director of Uplift, who are bringing one of the cases against Rosebank. Tessa, what signal is the government sending with this decision?
Well, it's sending a signal that is vastly different from the last government, which is that it is not going to actively encourage the extraction of new oil and gas from the UK's North Sea, which is the direction that we've got to go in urgently if we're going to stave off the climate crisis, and also do the right thing by the people who currently work in the industry and the communities in Scotland who really need a plan for their future that moves away from oil and gas.
Has Uplift has any conversations with key Labour ministers about this decision? Did you know it was coming?
We did not, no.
Have you had discussions in general with the government, though, about their direction of travel, as it were, when it pertains to oil and gas licenses?
We haven't met with any ministers since this new government took shape. We, are very pleased to see in the Labor Party's manifesto a commitment to ending new oil and gas exploration licensing. That is a critically needed and, in many respects, given where the rest of the world is going, it's a very progressive position to have adopted on climate. We obviously want them to go further than that. As I said, we desperately want to see more detail about their plans for a transition for the oil and gas workforce and for communities with ties to the industry. But in general, the signals from the government having both pulled out of defending the case against the Cumbria coal mine, now also dropping their defence against the Rosebank oil field and the Jackdaw gas field. I mean, those are all things that I think deserve to be commended.
Is this decision by the government not to defend these licenses the final nail in the coffin?
Well, we certainly hope so. But the way that this is going to play out is that the government is, as you say, not defending our challenge, but the companies involved, so that is Equinor, a Norwegian oil giant that is trying to develop Rosebank, Shell, everybody's favourite oil and gas company that's trying to develop Jackdaw, those companies are likely to try to still fight this in court. So we do have to wait for a final decision from the Court of Session, probably to come in the next few months, about whether or not the government's decision to approve Rosebank and Jackdaw was unlawful. And then once we have that decision, and we assume that it will be that it was unlawful because the government's accepted that that's the case, then it will be up to those companies to decide whether or not they want to resubmit or restart the process of applying for those same development permits. And then it will be up to the government once again to decide whether or not to approve those. But the Labor government is on the record saying that they think that Rosebank is a disaster for the UK public. It's not just a climate disaster, it's also involves giving billions of pounds of tax breaks to incredibly wealthy oil and gas companies. It's an economically absurd proposition. It does nothing for our energy security or our energy affordability. So we think it's a pretty watertight case to reject that if it does come back to the government.
Instead of oil and gas licenses, what are the concrete ways you want the Labour government to be investing in this green transition?
Well, the most urgent thing that we need to do is rapidly scale up our renewable energy resources. And that's not just from a climate perspective. Renewable energy is also the only way that we're going to protect all of the families and households across the country who are incredibly worried about their household energy bills going into this winter. Our dependency on gas is what's driven up our energy bills. It is the only way that we can keep those bills down in the long term. So we want to see a massive, rapid build out of renewable energy, but also just as crucially, we want to make sure that the investment in the renewable energy industry, the supply chains, the jobs, all of the benefits of that industry go to the communities that have historically been dependent on fossil fuel sectors like oil and gas, so that there is a fair transition and we make sure that actually Scotland, which has some of the best renewable resources in the world, can really benefit from the prosperity that should bring.
Are these suggestions possible under the austerity budget that Labour has warned is coming in autumn?
Well, we're obviously, like everyone, waiting to see exactly what's in that budget. I mean, the government has so far, I think, made one very important step in that general direction, which is the establishment of GB Energy. We obviously need to wait and see exactly what the mandate of GB Energy is, where it's going to be based, what it's going to do. But, the suggestion is that it will create tens of thousands of new jobs, and that those jobs could be used to support people out of high carbon sectors. But absolutely, I mean, when you think about the way that other countries have invested in this transition, attracted investment, scaled up energy, renewable energy at the scale that we need, it's required proper industrial strategy, and it's required a fair bit of investment behind that. So we absolutely do need to see that scale of investment if there is any credible pathway towards those goals, which the Labor government has made its own goals, by the way, including decarbonising the power sector by 2030.
Peter Hendy is the Labour government's new Minister for Trains. Now, he's an unelected politician thanks to being appointed as a life peer in 2022. Hendy's previous gig was as the chair of Network Rail. That is the government-owned organisation that manages the UK's rail infrastructure. And it turns out that while in that role, Hendy abused his power to get an award-winning engineer sacked for raising safety concerns about Euston Station in London. That engineer was Gareth Dennis, who also hosts a popular podcast about the railways. Earlier this year, Dennis spoke to a journalist writing this article for The Independent. Uncomfortable, unpleasant, unsafe. How London's Euston Station became hell on earth. And yes, those are Dennis's words in the headline, part of a much larger discussion of how Euston is no longer fit for purpose. But Peter Hendy was not happy. Internal emails seen by Politico show that Hendy was very annoyed by this quote from the Independent article. You're talking about thousands of people squished into that space. It's not just uncomfortable, it's not just unpleasant, it's unsafe. Dennis's comments were based on a September 2023 improvement notice issued to Network Rail about overcrowding at Euston Station. In it, the Office for Rail and Road warned Network Rail of the risks to passenger safety caused by crowding and passenger surges at the station. So Dennis wasn't saying anything that wasn't already in the public domain. That didn't matter to Hendy, though, who instructed his communications officer to look into Dennis, writing this. Please check whether we have and or are currently employing him, as we should stop. Accusing Network Rail of operating the station unsafely is unacceptable. When Hendy discovered that Dennis was in fact employed by subcontractor Sistra, he wrote a letter on Network Rail headed paper to Sistra's CEO saying this. Gareth Dennis is a Sistra employee, so he must write with your authority. Please let me know what evidence you have to substantiate his allegations, or alternatively, what action you are taking if what he alleges is not your company's view. Employees here know that what they say in the media reflects on their employment, and I should like confirmation that your employees understand that too. And of course, finding a potential supplier criticising a possible client reflects adversely on the likelihood of your doing business with us or our supply chain. Did you spot that threat there? It was hardly very veiled. Sistra's CEO wrote back to Hendy apologising for, quote, any alarm this may have caused in your organisation after reading the article. But Hendy was not satisfied. Writing back to the CEO on May 19th this year, he demanded further action against Dennis and threatened to, quote, take it up with your head office and shareholders. On May 20th, just a day later, Dennis was suspended from the engineering firm. He was then offered a financial settlement to leave Sistra on the condition that he signed a confidentiality agreement. Dennis refused and was formally dismissed 6 weeks later after a disciplinary panel hearing. In Dennis's letter of dismissal, Sistra says this. As a result of the article on the 14th of May 2024, Sistra Limited received a complaint from Lord Peter Hendy, chairman of Network Rail, a Sistra Limited key client. To this end, your conduct has brought the name/reputation of Sistra Limited and Network Rail into disrepute. That makes it pretty clear that Peter Hendy's obsessive vendetta against Gareth Dennis was the driving factor in his sacking by Sistra. And for what? Pointing out the risks to the safety of the public at Euston Station. This is who the Labour government thinks should be in charge of our railways, a man who'd rather have someone fired than address the failures he's pointing out. In response to the Politico article that broke this story, Network Rail said this. The rail regulator's concerns raised in September 2023 about passenger congestion at Euston Station were addressed and put to bed in December 2023, months before the article to which Dennis contributed was published. Decisions on how employee conduct is handled is a matter for employers, in this case, Sistra. The Department of Transport has refused to comment on Peter Hendy's conduct while head of Network Rail. But joining me now is the engineer at the centre of this story, Gareth Dennis, also host of the Rail Natter podcast. Gareth, when did you become aware of what Peter Hendy had done?
The moment when I received a slightly terse email from someone a few lines up the chain of command from me going, can we have a quick meeting urgently? We need to talk about this Euston article. And at that point it was, can you just, okay, this article, right, there's some evidence presumably behind this. And I said, oh yeah, sure, here's some evidence. Here's the ORR improvement notice. You've summarized beautifully, by the way, Moya, nicely did. It's like, oh God, live through this again. Yeah. So the improvement notice, but also there was a document that HS2 Limited, the organisation overseeing or was overseeing the redevelopment of half of the Euston sort of station site. They published as part of the how do we not spend any money at Euston reports that they've been having to deal with for the previous government. They were looking at a report of what happens if we don't do anything at Euston. And that report said within the next decade, the station would have to close regularly as a result of unsafe levels of overcrowding. So it's not just the improvement notice. That was the other thing. The third thing is I happen to have co-founded the campaign for level boarding with a certain Tanny Gray Thompson a few years back in a pumpkin cafe in Darlington Station. Tanny also having her own problems with the railway this week related to accessibility and safety. Anyway, so I am the co-founder of the Campaign for Level Boarding, and I deal with a lot of accessibility issues, and I hear a lot of issues from particularly disabled activists and campaigners and passengers. And Euston just comes up again and again. So when that station is crush filled safely, apparently, when it's crush filled, it's really unpleasant if you're walking around. But imagine if you're in a wheelchair or trying to negotiate through with behind a guide dog. It's just unacceptable. So I passed all that evidence on, and that was then sent in a reasonably weak worded email, I have to say, from the CEO back to Hendy, and Hendy just ignored all that and then sent his second threat, legally dubious threat through to my former employer. So that was kind of how it all kicked off, really.
What have the last 3 months been like for you?
Yeah, it's been pretty grim. So I have ADHD, and a sudden change in circumstance, as anyone who has ADHD through the COVID lockdowns will know, is not good for the old capital M, capital H mental health. So that's been pretty grim. But I also have a 1-year-old child that I've had to actually, in a way, has got me through the last 3 months. But knowing that their future is, kind of wrapped up so much into mine, let's put it that way. I have a very, very supportive wife. Yes, I'm a wife guy. I have a very supportive wife who has also been wonderful and supported me. But, I was potentially letting her down as well, and the ramifications of that. And, what did it actually mean for my ability to talk about this industry? And would they get the better of me and shut me up? Well, no is the answer. They clearly didn't. What's strange in this, and I'm sure you might pick this up, what's very bizarre is just the extent to which having had a voice in the media to start this story and obviously have some connection with journalists, they thought it was a good idea to string me out, corner me, and also cut me off in such a way that they can no longer hold me accountable in any way whatsoever, let alone Hendy sending these dubious at best letters and emails, which, by the way, obviously I could just subject access request and freedom of information request out. It's just very bizarre. So yeah, it's not been good for me the last 3 months, but today, when I could finally talk about it publicly, has been glorious. Some catharsis anyway.
Yeah, I'm so sorry that you've gone through this. Do you know of anyone else who's suffered similar ramifications for speaking about the rail industry? What's the culture like for talking publicly about the issues?
So I have to say that it's a mix, but so there have been positive steps about safety culture, and I'd be just making a bit of a story out of nothing if I didn't say there have been positive steps about safety culture in the industry, and actually on lots of measures of safety other than accessibility, other than the platform train interface, other than those, there has been progress. But when it comes to accessibility, when it comes to safety of passengers at stations in particular, when it's related to crowding, or in trains when it's related to crowding, there has been inaction, frankly. And it's something that the industry really fails on, but not just that. So to your first question, I've had lots of messages today, and I know of stories previously as well from people going, thank you so much for talking out, I couldn't. And those stories are disproportionate, bearing in mind this is an industry that is not well represented for women, people of color, queer folk. Those messages are, a high proportion of those are from women, some from queer folk. So, the young people who are in this industry that the industry purports to be, isn't it great that we're diversifying? As soon as those people get ideas above their station, this happens. The old white boys come in and realize that a world that they no longer understand and no longer really have control over is holding them accountable in a way they do not like.
Mm. And obviously, when Hendy pressured your former employer to sack you, that happened in May. It started in May. Between that period, he's been made rail minister in the new Labour government. How did you react when you heard that happened?
So that announcement happened on the day I received the letter from Sistra saying they were going to sack me. So that's not related. That is pure coincidence. But it was a rather unpleasant coincidence that happened on the day when I was seeing prominent people in the industry going, hooray, isn't it wonderful? Lord Hendy, the bus deregulation millionaire, is now going to be in charge of the railways. Fantastic. He's a hero for our railways, a man of the people, somewhat forgetting his rather unpleasant stances during the strikes a couple of years back. But anyway, this is, there was a celebration as he was appointed. He was going to be the savior of the industry. Well, hopefully his career is now going to be rather short, and he'll have no part to play in the new shape of the rail industry.
What was his actual tenure at Network Rail like?
Well, let's just pick out some of the highlights, shall we? So in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, we saw a government decide that railways were a bad idea. We saw the timetable collapse of 2018 well in advance of the timetable of the COVID pandemic. We saw funding after the COVID pandemic being cut by government. We saw HS2 being hugely curtailed, massively limiting the ability of rail to move people away from damaging modes like road and air. We've seen absolutely no movement whatsoever in improving accessibility on our railways. There's no rolling program of platform corrections. We've seen new trains being purchased that don't provide independent access for disabled people. I have to say it's not a great legacy, frankly. He's been in position as chair of Network Rail for almost a decade. What measurably has improved over that period? Because actually we've seen what he's presided over is the end of Britain's railway renaissance. That's really his legacy. It's not necessarily a very good one.
You've called for Hendy's resignation. Why do you think he has to go?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't want to pretend to be a lawyer here because I'm decidedly not, but I would suggest that, particularly on the laws that we've inherited from the EU, threatening a supplier on contract, that you will tamper with their ability to win contract based on the discussions of an individual employee referring to publicly available safety information is dubious, if not illegal. So on the basis that would comprise misconduct in a public office, that's the end of the road for him. But I think that's legalese. For me, it goes much deeper than this. If this is his view of people who are within the industry, but realize that the conventional, if you like, internal channels for change are a complete waste of time and are a way to store statistics and not actually create change, and decide that the best way to create change is to make people feel a little bit uncomfortable, so perhaps they do make change. If the response to that is to sack them, and all the people who don't have a voice, who he might have sacked, that's got him to the point where he can have such hubris to write what he wrote in those emails, he is not fit to shape what our railway industry is going to look like, because that's what his role is. That's what he's been put there to do, is to shape Britain's rail industry, one of the most, if not, looking at my book, which is coming out in a couple of months, the most important industry in our country for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and improving equality in this country. He's going to be in charge of what the shape of that industry is going to be going forwards. I do not think he's the right person to do that at all. And I think this sorry episode is somewhat punctuation at the end of that.
Gareth Dennis, thank you as ever for speaking to us. And I'm sure in a couple of months when your book comes out, we can talk to you even more. And I hope that today has been a bit of a balm after the hell of the last 3 months. Anyway, thank you again. Plenty of adults have found the last 14 years of Tory rule a source of deep unhappiness. Austerity, culture wars, and scandal have torn into the fabric of Britain's social life. And that's before we get into Fred again. But it turns out teens have been affected too. And guess what? The kids are very much not okay. A new study has found that the UK's 15-year-olds are suffering a happiness recession, coming at the bottom of a European satisfaction league. The study was conducted by the Children's Society in 2021 and 2022. Not only did Britain's 15-year-olds rank as the unhappiest in Europe, but the proportion reporting low life satisfaction was much, much greater than that of many of their nearest counterparts. While only 7% of Dutch teenagers felt unhappy, a quarter of UK teens reported low levels of satisfaction with their lives. France, Sweden, and Ireland all had fewer unhappy teens. Only Poland's percentage came close to Britain's. The proportion of unhappy 15-year-olds in Britain is also more than double that of Finland, Denmark, Romania, Portugal, Croatia, and Hungary. So, what's the cause? Well, food poverty was cited as a key reason behind the high misery level, and girls, as well as those from disadvantaged backgrounds, were also more likely to report low levels of satisfaction with their lives. The Children's Society has been conducting these surveys since 2009, and their results show a trend. Children's happiness scores were highest between 2009 and 2012, but just as the Tories' austerity policies began to bite, they began to fall. I was very lucky. I was probably the last generation of really happy kids, and they've kept dropping ever since. Given the correlation between Tory rule and unhappiness, it's perhaps unsurprising that the study also found that the UK had the largest gap in happiness between the most advantaged and the least disadvantaged, and the most disadvantaged teens. The report goes on to give this analysis of the results. Children and young people deserve better. Decisive action and national leadership are needed to overturn the decline in children's well-being. We know these experiences are not lived in a vacuum. The pandemic, rising levels of poverty, concerns over young people's safety, the climate emergency, and other stresses have put a strain on young people's lives and can prevent the experience of a happy and fulfilled childhood. Micha, you do a lot of work around mental health. How do you see teenagers impacted?
Yeah, I think these findings are no surprise to me. I think that this is something that I talk a lot about in Mad World, which is a book that I wrote on the politics of mental health. The fact that our mental health, our suffering cannot be disentangled from our political conditions. And as you mentioned, there are so many factors like the climate emergency that makes it very hard to look forward to the future. The impacts of over a decade of austerity, the decimation of public services and community. I think it's very hard to feel optimistic about the future. And I think that we often talk about this with regards to the general population, but obviously this is also impacting children and teenagers. I think it's really important that we don't talk about suffering in a vacuum because, like you say, it correlates with poverty and inequality. 12% of children experience food poverty in the UK. That's actually more than a higher proportion than the number of adults. And then we've seen the impact specifically of things like youth centres being cut throughout Tory austerity. They're also obviously entering into a very hostile job market that looks different to the one that maybe you or I were entering into when we were entering our early 20s. You know, lots of people are working in precarious gig economy jobs in which wages are falling. And this is also correlated with very negative mental health outcomes. So whether we call it kind of mental health, mental distress, or whether we call it, you know, as they call it in this study, a happiness recession, I think it's really important that we don't individualize these findings. I also think often when we see kind of conversations about young people's mental health, there can be a tendency to kind of overstate or just emphasize specific factors over others. So, for example, I feel like social media comes up again and again when we talk about young people's mental health. And obviously this does play a role, but I also think that state violence, you know, the impacts of things also like racism, marginalization, the far right violence that we've seen recently, I think it's kind of taken as common sense, on the left, that these things affect adults, and we need to acknowledge that they're definitely going to affect young people too. So yeah, I really hope that we can use these findings to kind of campaign around these political conditions, because, children, young people, they are our future, and maybe there's an argument we can make there for building a better future where fewer people suffer.
Don't you find it so interesting the way that, with this sort of research comes out and this language, happiness recession, has to be used to market it and make it of interest? Like, that's financial language applied to the levels of well-being of teenagers. I don't know what you think about that. Like, it's fascinating the way we have to sell this to people to make them interested.
Yeah, I think it really is. And I think that language is something that I have complicated feelings about, because I feel like the description of it as a recession obviously evokes ideas about the economy, our political climate impacting on how well we are. But at the same time, happiness recession in some ways feels at the same time a bit euphemistic, or as if it doesn't describe the genuine kind of misery and suffering that people are really experiencing in an adequate way. So I think there's kind of pros and cons to it.
This summer's general election saw a deeply unpopular Conservative government swept out of office after 14 years in power. Many, many people in the UK were glad to see the back of the Tories. But are they that enthusiastic about their replacement, Starmer's Labour? Well, when we look at the approval ratings coming in for the new government, they aren't that great, and they're quickly getting worse. For the first time since coming to power, a majority of Brits now disapprove of the Labour government's record. Only 23% say they approve, down 3 points from when YouGov last asked just 10 days ago. What has happened in the last 10 days? Those approval ratings are, of course, not as bad as the last government's, but what is noticeable here is, 1, the direction of travel, and 2, the pace at which disapproval has increased. Labour have been in government less than 2 months. No honeymoon for you, Keir. Now, that rise in disapproval is being driven primarily by older voters. With these voters, disapproval ratings have exceeded that of the last Tory government. 72% of over 65 say they disapprove, to only 16% saying they approve. Some might respond to this that governments are always unpopular, which is somewhat true. And, older generations tend not to be as supportive of Labour as Tories if we still look along those binary lines. But if we zoom out to a wider scale, we can see that in previous times, such as mid-2021, just as many people approved as disapproved of the government. Now, I'm wondering what's behind this. Micha, do you think this is something to do with, the economic policies that Rachel Reeves has been putting forward? I know that pension fuel payment has gone down like a lead balloon. Or is it something else? Is there a disillusionment among people, which means that their span for approving of governments is getting shorter and shorter? Tell me, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I mean, I think some of this was somewhat predictable with Keir Starmer, in the sense, the commentariat often described his win in the general election as a loveless landslide. Lots of people, I think, felt that they were holding their nose and voting Labour, and weren't necessarily excited about the potential of a Labour government. So I'm not surprised that people are starting to feel dissatisfied. Starmer's platform that he ran on constantly promised vague kind of change, but he sold himself as a sensible politician, someone who wasn't going to pull any big surprises out of the bag. But maybe we kind of expected that after over a decade of Tory rule, we would feel something, some level of, okay, maybe things are getting slightly better. And so I think that dissatisfaction is maybe starting to come through. I think that, people maybe were feeling that there would be some distinction from, the Tories, and that actually things don't necessarily feel that different. And obviously that raises the question of, is this leaving the door open to the far right to come in as the opposition? But I also think, the reasons why people are dissatisfied go further to, like you say, touching on policy and things like this. So, there's been this kind of scandal that people have been talking about around Labour cronyism. I think it was 2/3 of British people said that they feel the Labour government only wants to help itself and its allies. People are saying that they feel that this government is corrupt. And there have been, a number of things that have made the headlines about, for example, one of Keir Starmer's biggest donors getting a free security pass for number 10. So I think there's also the fuel allowance, which you mentioned, which might explain some of why it's kind of the older demographic who have really, really rapidly kind of gone down in their ratings for Keir Starmer's approval. That was a payment of up to £300 that was supposed to support pensioners in paying their heating bills. And now that's only going to go to people who are on benefits. So I think that makes sense that has upset that group. But yeah, I think overall it's just really bad news for Starmer. You usually expect a bit of a honeymoon period for new prime ministers. And it feels like he had a very mild one, like it barely existed. And now it's kind of over before it started. But maybe this is a sign that he actually needs to do something that's more than kind of more of the same Tory-like policies.
Indeed. I mean, we'd always all predict that the honeymoon period would be brutally short, but maybe not this short. Micha, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Short but sweet.
Thank you, Moya. It's been great to be on again.
I'm sure we'll have a couple more times together before I depart for good. Thank you, everyone, for watching this evening. The show will be back tomorrow. You have been watching Novara Media. Don't you forget it. Good night.